Shakespeare's Pears podcast, yeah. Shakespeare Pears podcast, yeah. Yeah! Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Shakespeare's Pears podcast. My name is Netta Rogovsky, and I studied poetry around the world and am a published poet myself.
And I'm Ava Miller, Shakespearean expert. I have studied abroad in Italy for 7 years studying Shakespeare's plays. Today, we will be discussing one of my all-time personal favorites, A Midsummer Night's Dream.
This play is absolutely incredible, one of Shakespeare's most famous comedies. This Renaissance comedy was written in the 1600s and was greatly influenced by mythology and Chaucer. This play is very much like Romeo and Juliet with a happy ending.
It follows 3 groups of people from juxtaposing worlds, including the upper-class Athenians, the tradesmen, and the fairies. There was a little background. However, if you have not read the play, I advise that you return after you do so because we have major spoilers.
In today's episode, we will be discussing the prevalence of gender roles, the presence of misogyny, discuss Shakespeare's purpose for the play.
I think a great place to start is asking a question. What position do gender roles hold in this play? Is it a driving force?
Well, I think we should start by discussing the gender dynamic, which clearly makes up the bones of this play. There's a clear divide between men and women. Men have a say over women, they have a superiority, and women is treated as property and they are oppressed. There's a battle between the genders and the desires in a patriarchal society, which creates serious conflicts in the stories, and this is why gender roles are so important in this specific play.
Right, and throughout the story we can see that there are many severe conflicts that develop specifically in the fairy world and the upper class group. These severe conflicts are a result of clashing desires between genders. For example, Hermia's dad, Eugeius, really tries to control her, but Hermia clearly doesn't like that. Eugeius is trying to control who Hermia marries. He wants to forbid her from marrying Lysander and instead set her up with Demetrius. It's clear that Hermia doesn't want to be pawned off like property to a man that she doesn't love. In Act 1, Scene 1, where we first meet Eugeius, he states, "Full of vexation come I with complaint against my child, my daughter Hermia. This man hath my consent to marry her," referring to Demetrius. Here it is clear that in this society and in this play, Eugeius has power over his daughter Hermia, and this is where the core of the conflicts spouts from. Additionally, Demetrius feels as though he has control over Hermia because her father Eugeius, a respected man in society, kind of farther up on the hierarchy, arranged this marriage. So regardless where Hermia's feelings lie, Demetrius feels as though he has control over her as well. There's clearly a camaraderie between Eugeius and Demetrius. However, Demetrius feels as though he has this power over this woman. In Act 1, Scene 1, where we first meet him, he states, "Relent, sweet Hermia, and Lysander, yield thy crazed title to my servant right." It's clear that he thinks and he feels strongly that he has this right to Hermia.
That's a good point, Ava. Additionally, another example of that would be in the fairies world, where the fairy king and queen, Titania and Oberon, are fighting over the possession of the Indian boy, where Titania wants to keep him as her attendant, while Oberon wants to take ownership of him and make him his knight. Titania believes that she should have possession of the little boy because she had a relationship with his mother, his biological mother, who passed away. Oberon wants the little boy because he believes he will make a great knight. In Act 2, Scene 1, Oberon quotes, "Why should Titania cross Oberon? But I do beg a little changeling boy to be my henchman."
That quote does show that Oberon wants this boy for a selfish reason. He wants the boy so he can raise the boy and have the boy be attending to him and be a servant to him. He doesn't really care or have any regards for the fact that his wife has a sentimental connection to this child and feels like she owes something to his mother.
And I have another quote from Act 2, Scene 1, that where Titania talks about the fact that she believes that she should have possession of the boy because of her relationship with his biological mother. So Titania states, "And for her sake, I do rear up her boy, and for her sake, I will not part with him."
From this, I believe it's fair to say that people making decisions in this story are men.
Right.
And problems are created because women don't want to comply with the men and the patriarchal society.
That's an interesting point. Circling back to the upper class social circle, when Hermia and Lysander ran away into the woods and Helena decided to tell Demetrius about it so that he would chase them, and she chased him into the woods. When she met with him, she was treated terribly. She was being verbally abused. In Act 2, Scene 1, Demetrius states, "If thou follow me, do not believe that I shall do thee mischief in the wood." Demetrius is saying that if Helena does not stop following him, he doesn't have control over what he will do to her in the woods, and he will do terrible things to her just because she's following him.
It shows that he believes that if some woman, which is Helena, does something wrong, he is entitled to do bad things to her. Obviously, it's disgusting, but it's just
absolutely terrible.
It shows the dynamic between the characters where women have to be afraid that they're going to mess up because, they'll do stuff like that.
Well, I think from this point, it's fair to ask, is Shakespeare misogynistic, or is its introduction of patriarchy satirical?
From our class discussions, it's fair to say that there is two sides to this argument, but to start with why I believe Shakespeare is misogynistic, the play itself, Act 1, Scene 1, opens with the wedding between an independent icon, Hippolyta, is forced to get married to Theseus because she lost a bet. Historically, Hippolyta is a matriarch, iconic, independent character, and she's being stripped of it by a man, and they're forcing her into a patriarchy in the very start of this play. It kind of sets a theme for male superiority and the oppression of women that follows, which is very misogynistic.
I agree with that, and furthermore, I think that ancient Athens was a symbol of the patriarchy, which brings me to my next point, which I want to discuss the conflict between Hermia and Eugeus. As in Act 1, Scene 1, Eugeus states, "As she is mine, I may dispose of her, which shall be either to this gentleman," referring to Demetrius, "or to her death, according to our law." Well, I believe that this quote shows that the Athenian law itself enforces patriarchy and misogyny, specifically making it so women, in this case Hermia, are being objectified.
I totally understand where you're coming from. Another example is how Helena is portrayed as extremely insecure and desperate for the love of Demetrius, which proves the patriarchy in the society where the story takes place. Helena, when talking to Demetrius in Act 2, Scene 1, says, "And yet a place of high respect with me, then be used as you use your dog." By saying this, it shows that society puts such an emphasis on male superiority that Helena would rather be treated like a dog than rejected by a man that she admires, Demetrius.
To build on to that, Helena in the story is portrayed as neurotic, even though she ultimately is acting the same exact way as Demetrius. Just to open that a little bit, Helena is chasing Demetrius and making him uncomfortable, and she is painted as this crazy character, while ultimately Demetrius is doing the same exact thing, chasing Hermia, who's in love with Lysander and wants nothing to do with him. This stereotype is misogynistic, and it proves that Shakespeare is being misogynistic because he portrays Helena as the insecure, overly emotional, stereotypical woman, and not Demetrius in the same sense, while they're acting very similarly.
Great point, Netta. I think it shows that women are definitely negatively impacted and degraded by the choices of men in this play.
Additionally to that, the tradesmen also had to play women's parts in the play, Pyramus and Thisbe, that they were putting on for the wedding, which was normal for how society worked back then.
However, I agree with what we've said. I think it's important to mention that it could be argued that Shakespeare is trying to be satirical and almost make a mockery of the patriarchy. For example, Hermia and Titania really did try to resist the patriarchy at some points, and that shows that he could be acknowledging the appearance of feminists in a patriarchal society and resistance to the masculine control. I think that this could potentially show that Shakespeare sees the fault in patriarchy and he's kind of making a mockery of it. So, for example, Titania, as we explained previously, she didn't automatically give the boy over to her husband because he wanted it, and he was higher up on the hierarchy because he was a man. She fought for what she wanted. Additionally, Hermia stated that in Scene 1, Act 1, when Eugeus was trying to set her up with Demetrius, "So will I grow, so live, so die, my lord, ere I will yield my virgin patent up," saying that she would rather die than be sold off to someone she doesn't love, which is essentially fighting against the patriarchy. Hermia ultimately runs away with Lysander because she doesn't want to have to succumb to her father.
That's a good point, but while that may be true, I do want to bring up that every conflict in this play ended up being solved by a man.
Right, and also, we can't sit here and say that we know Shakespeare's purpose for writing this play. We don't know Shakespeare personally, but he could have easily been writing this comedy for entertainment purposes and just mirroring it off of the societal environment of the time he was writing it, which would have been patriarchal and misogynistic.
Right, he was reflecting what he was seeing. Towards the end of the play, in Act 4, Scene 1, Theseus states, "Eugeus, I will overbear your will, for in the temple by and by, and with us these couples shall eternally be knit." This means that although Theseus is solving the problem, he permitted the couples to marry who they wanted in the end.
A great point. I also think that the way that the fairy world conflict was solved in Scene 4, Act 1 proves patriarchy in the story as well. Titania woke up confused as to why she was in a strange position with Bottom, who was a half donkey man at the time, and when she asked Oberon for clarification, he told her to, quote, silence a while. And the two danced, and it seemed like all the tension had been settled on both parts. Oberon even proposed the idea that they dance together at Theseus and Hippolyta's wedding, now that they, quote, are new in amity. The way that their conflict was resolved seems very one-sided to me, which I think contributes to Shakespeare's portrayal of male and female power struggles in the play. Their conflict was terminated as a result of Oberon, the male figure, getting what he wanted, the Indian boy. Oberon was left happy with the boy, and Titania just forgave him. Regardless of the dramatic irony that the readers know that Oberon is keeping a hefty secret that he roofied her from his wife, from what she knew, he treated her terribly and was extremely selfish and dismissive with her. Their conflict was resolved because he declared that they were friends again and missed his wife's confusion. Oberon's ability to end their tension after getting what he wanted and Titania's compliance shows that the females in the society really do have no power.
And also, Oberon's interference with the Cupid flower juice and his pity for Helena is really the only reason why the complicated love web between the upper class society couples was sorted. Even though it was still messy and Puck gave the Cupid flower juice to the wrong person, without Demetrius under the magic spell that Oberon initiated, Hermia would still be upset. Demetrius would still want Hermia. Demetrius and Lysander would still be at odds, and Helena and Hermia would still be fighting. So
I agree. I think that's a great point. And also, at the end of the play, where all of the conflicts were tied up and there was a need for comic relief, the group of men, the actors, were able to lighten the mood, and that group of men concluded the play and provided such comic relief. So I think in conclusion, I believe, and do you?
Yes.
That Shakespeare is misogynistic, and the story is misogynistic based on what we know about the culture at the time. He was most likely wasn't woke as a white privileged man in the society that benefited him.
Yeah.
That concludes today's episode of Shakespeare's Pairs, brought to you by Ave Miller
And Netta Rogovsky.
We would have loved to discuss the connections between this beautiful play and the modern world. So catch that on the next episode of our podcast.
Thank you so very much. Stay tuned for the next one. Yay!
Yay!